Chapter 3. The 2:15 a.m. knock. The damp chill of the cellar seemed to seep into their very bones as Nancy and Bess stood at the foot of the locked stairs. The only sound was the rhythmic drip-drop of seawater hitting the stone floor. Nancy shined her electric torch along the perimeter of the foundation, where the hand-hewn granite met the natural shelf of the cliff. "Nancy, what if they don't come back?" Bess whispered, her breath hitching. "What if we're stuck down here until Captain Thorne returns from Boston?" "Don't worry, Bess. Someone went to a lot of trouble to lock this door. That means they have a schedule to keep," Nancy replied calmly. She moved the light toward the wettest part of the wall, where the hydraulic lift was bolted into the stone. "Look at the floor here. These aren't just puddles, they're tidal pools." Nancy knelt, pointing the beam at a narrow, horizontal fissure at the base of the rock. It was obscured by a stack of rotted lobster crates, but the air blowing through the gap was fresh and smelled intensely of the open Atlantic. "It's a sea cave entrance," Nancy realized. "At low tide, someone could boat right under this house, but right now the tide is coming in. We can't go out that way, but we can use the lift's manual override." Nancy reached behind the steel pillar, her fingers searching the greasy mechanism until they found a small iron lever painted a dull red. With a grunt of effort, she pulled. There was a groan of metal on metal, and then, thrum, 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 the ceiling above them began to shiver. A section of the cellar ceiling, disguised with false floor joists, slowly retracted. It didn't lead to the sunroom, but to a narrow priest-hole staircase tucked behind the kitchen pantry. "Quickly, Bess!" They scrambled up the hidden steps just as the sound of a motorboat echoed through the cavern below. Nancy slid the secret panel shut behind them, her heart hammering against her ribs. They emerged into the dark kitchen, the house eerily silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. "We need to get to our rooms," Nancy whispered. "If they think we're still locked in the cellar, we have the advantage of surprise." They retreated to the upper floor, but sleep was impossible. Nancy sat by the window of her guest room, her gold pocket watch, a gift from her father, resting in her palm. The moon was a sliver of bone behind the main fog. 1:45 a.m., 2 a.m., 2:10 a.m. Then, at exactly 2:15 a.m., it began. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't a random sound. It was heavy, rhythmic, and muffled, echoing through the very bones of Whaler's watch. It sounded like a giant heartbeat, pulsing 3 times, then stopping for 10 seconds before repeating. "Nancy!" A pale figure appeared in the doorway. It was Bess, wrapped in a heavy wool robe, her face white. "It's the ghost! It's exactly like the villagers said. The heart of the Whaler is beating in the walls." "It's not a heart, Bess," Nancy said, standing up and grabbing her coat. "It's a signal or a pump." Nancy led the way back down to the sunroom, moving like a shadow. She didn't turn on her torch. Instead, she relied on the faint, ghostly glow of the moon reflecting off the sea. As they reached the sunroom door, Nancy put a finger to her lips. The thumping was louder here. It was coming from behind the oak-paneled wall, the very spot the scrimshaw teeth were pointing toward. Suddenly, a sliver of light appeared at the edge of the panel. The wall didn't swing open like a door. It slid upward with a mechanical hiss. Through the gap, Nancy saw a man's silhouette. He was wearing a dark slicker and a Greek fisherman's cap, his back to them as he worked a set of iron pulleys. Beside him stood a familiar figure. The moonlight caught the delicate features of Clara, the seamstress, the woman who had sold Bess the lavender sachets in the village square just that afternoon. She wasn't holding sewing needles now. She was holding a heavy, industrial-sized flashlight and a ledger. "The fog is lifting," Clara hissed, her voice sharp and devoid of her earlier sweetness. "If the cargo isn't in the truck by 3, the Coast Guard will spot the Mary Jane offshore. Move the crates, Arthur." Arthur grunted as he hauled a heavy, waxed-sealed crate from the hydraulic lift. "What about the girls? They're still in the cellar. We can't leave them there forever." "We won't have to," Clara replied coldly. "Once the truck is loaded, we'll leave the door unlocked. By the time they tell the local sheriff, we'll be across the state line. Now, keep that pump going. The lift won't hold the weight if the pressure drops." Thump, thump, thump. The ghostly knocking was the sound of the manual pressure pump. Nancy realized that Whaler's Watch wasn't just a house, it was a sophisticated high-speed smuggling terminal. Nancy pulled Bess back into the shadows of the hallway. "We can't stop them alone, Bess. There are at least 2 of them, and likely more at the truck." "What do we do?" Bess whispered, her teeth chattering. "We need to get to the roadster. If we can reach the village telegraph office, we can intercept that cargo before it leaves the cove. But first, I need that ledger Clara is holding. It's the only thing that will prove Captain Thorne isn't behind this." Nancy reached in her pocket and pulled out the small, tarnished brass button from London, her lucky charm. "Stay here, Bess. When I create a distraction, run for the car." "Nancy, wait!" But Nancy was already moving. She picked up a heavy glass paperweight from a side table and hurled it toward the far end of the darkened foyer. Crash! "What was that?" Arthur shouted, dropping the pulleys. As the 2 smugglers ran toward the sound, Nancy darted into the sunroom, her hand reaching for the ledger resting on the mantel. But as her fingers brushed the leather cover, a cold, gloved hand clamped down on her wrist. "Looking for something, Miss Drew?" Clara's voice whispered in her ear. "To be continued."